Good morning. Well, Romans chapter 7 is one of those really strange chapters, isn't it? Because the previous chapter is all about the victory of the life of Jesus over our sinfulness. And then we have a whole passage in this chapter about how what a struggle it is living in the flesh. And I think what we're seeing here is Paul expressing what we all express, really. There are spiritual truths that rule our lives. The spiritual truth is we were crucified with Christ. You were crucified with Christ. I was crucified with Christ. It's as if we've died already. We've begun eternal life. We're living for Jesus. We have the spiritual life begun within us to live for Jesus. But the day-to-day living of life includes the physical body, which although in a spiritual sense, in a real sense, in an eternal sense, has died with Christ and is dead to sin, and yet the wretched thing keeps doing things it shouldn't do. It's almost schizophrenic in a funny sort of way, you know. This is what Paul, he talks about it as if sin in his body is controlling him and not the spirit. But I woke up with a phrase in my mind. I hope you'll understand this. And the realities in this sentence is in inverted commas. Don't let the physical realities rob you of the spiritual truth. And the realities is in inverted commas. But this is what a walk of faith is all about. We need to know what Jesus has done for us, what changes he's made in our lives, what has been transformed. And when in our physical life we do silly things and we let the side down, as it were, and we do things, all right, hopefully we won't ever do what we call the big sins, really. We won't ever rob a bank or murder our neighbour, or, you know, hopefully we won't do any of the big sins, but we will still carry on doing the little things, you know, being selfish over things, all sorts of things. We can't get away from the fact, in inverted commas, that we are still physical beings living on this earth and that we are not perfect. But the spiritual truth is that God sees us robed in the righteousness of Jesus. He does not see us sinful as sinful creatures. We have been transformed. Just like the butterfly is so different to the caterpillar that if you put the two side to side, if you didn't actually know and watch what happens, you would think it was impossible for the caterpillar to become the butterfly, or for the water nymph to become the dragonfly. It's impossible. The two are chalk and cheese. The one limited to the ground, the other flying free in the air. And this is how radically different our physical life is to our spiritual life. And yet, somehow, the two have to live together until the Lord calls us home or he comes back. So Romans 7 is all about this tussle, this struggle in life. But he starts the chapter, doesn't he, talking about, again, about being dead, and using another illustration, and this time of marriage. In a marriage, a married woman, he says, is bound by law to her husband unless he dies. When he dies, she is freed from him. She's free to marry again. She's free to do with her life whatever she wants to do with her life, because her husband has died. And that is true. That's true. And that's what he says it's like for us. We were under the law. Those who lived under the law, he's perhaps talking more about Jews than Gentiles here, those who lived under the law, because of course the Jewish law doesn't apply to the Gentiles, because it was the Jews that were under covenant to the Lord, and he gave them the law. And if you lived under the law, if you died, the law no longer, when you're dead, the law no longer is obligatory to you. because think about it. The law says you should not be associated with dead people. Well, when you're dead, you're put with them, and you're breaking the law. Well, you can't break the law when you're dead. Sorry, that's a silly illustration. That's getting a bit trivial, but I'm trying to think it through, and it's very strange. So we are not, as Christians, bound by the Jewish law. It does not govern us. But what it does do is it shows us the sort of life that pleases God. It shows us the ideal that God held up to the Jewish nation. And many of us follow many of its precepts because they are wise. They are good practice, but they're not obligatory on any of us. None of them are. They are our choice to pick them up, but they're not to be made rules of. And he says in this funny little bit, what should we say? Is the law sin? In verse 7. If it hadn't been for the law, I wouldn't have known sin. This is the purpose of the law, is to show what sin is and how hard it is to be perfect, and that without Jesus we can't be perfect. But he says, that the law makes him sin in a sense. I wouldn't have known what it was to covet if the law hadn't said, you shall not covet. But sin, finding opportunity in the commandment, wrought in me all kinds of covetousness. Now that's a strange thing, but I remember hearing a preacher say once, that he was meditating on this little bit, and he thought about his son who was outside playing with his friends. He was about 8 or 9, the boy, and his friends were out playing. And he went out to them and he said, don't play on that bit of grass. Go over the other side and play on the other bit of grass. Don't play on that bit. And he went back indoors and left them to it. And it wasn't very long before the boys were deliberately playing on the bit of grass he told them not to play on. And it illustrated to him that there is something about being told you shouldn't do something that makes it that in a child, particularly a young child, makes them want to do the opposite. There's a core of rebelliousness in it. It's a bit like the terrible twos, the terrible twos. When my first child was in the terrible twos stage, she would say no to everything. So if we sat at a meal table and I said, eat your meal, she wouldn't eat it. And if I said, do this, she wouldn't do it. So I'm afraid I spent probably about 6 months exercising perverseness with my daughter. So I would say to her, don't sit at the table. And when she sat at the table, I'd say, don't eat your food, leave it. I don't want you to eat any of your food. And she'd eat every last scrap of it because she was in the rebellious state. She wanted to do exactly what I told her not to do. I'd say to her, don't go to bed. I don't want you to go to bed. Don't brush your teeth. Brush your teeth? I don't want you to brush your teeth. And she'd do the opposite because she was in that contrary stage that children go through. And it's like us, that especially teenagers, they want to do the opposite of what their parents tell them to do, don't they? And this is what life is like. So this is my thought for the day as you read this chapter, as you read this chapter. Don't let the physical realities rob you of the spiritual truth. The physical reality is we have to contend with sin all our lives, and we get it wrong at times. But the spiritual reality is that we have died to sin and we are alive to God in Jesus Christ. And it is impossible for that new life to sin. That's weird, isn't it? It's something to think about. Now, we come to Romans 8, which is such a wonderful chapter. I'm going to only ask you to read verses 1 to 11 of chapter 8. But read it today in 2 different versions, if you will, and we'll think about it tomorrow. God bless you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.